Thank you very much, Professor Basu. We have now half an hour for interaction, and what we have planned is questions for Professor Poga and perhaps for Professor Basu, but mainly for Professor Poga, because we won't have another chance to have him here for some time, and so we would direct questions to him. Yes, sir. There are microphones that are available, being brought to you. Gentleman in the jackets there. Yes, Mr. Code, behind.
Professor, you very rightly said and displayed through statistics that inequality in this world is increasing in spite of all the developments which are taking place. You also brought out a solution specifically for the pharmaceutical industry which could benefit the poor. But it is also a fact that lip service is played in every country by the rich towards the poor, and similarly at a macro level by the rich countries towards the poor nations. So as Professor Basu said, a representation must be given to voices of the poor. Sure, but these voices will be lost in the greater din of voices of the rich. So can we not visualize an institutional structure by which any international law which applies across nations will have to go through a filter, which is, let's say, a structure within the United Nations, which is constituted of members from the poor countries and members from countries which have large poor populations, although the country might be rich. And unless that filter clears a law, it shall not be enforced upon all countries. What do you think of this? Thank you.
Yes.
Is it working? Yeah. It's working. So I think it is a step in the right direction, but it's, I think, not the best step in that direction. And the reason for that is that if we had an institution like that, first of all, there's of course the big question whether we could institute it, whether there wouldn't be too much resistance to it. But if we had it, there would be a considerable danger that the representatives of the poor country governments, for example, would be bought off in various ways, that they would be bought by rich countries who want certain rules. So many of the governments of the poorer countries are oppressive and corrupt. Many of them are quite disconnected from the interests of their people. That happens especially in resource-rich countries, which we find a lot all over Africa. And I think it wouldn't be too hard to buy them off in ways by giving them weapons, for example, or loaning them money, or giving them favorable resource deals or something like that. So I think a somewhat better step in the same direction, exactly what you have in mind, would be something where you would have a group of independent experts evaluating, writing a written report about a particular piece of international rulemaking and saying, here are the main options that this particular piece of rulemaking can take, and we predict that the impact on poverty and the fulfillment of human rights more generally would be such and so for these options. And that would be something where experts would have to stake their reputation by coming up with a detailed finding, detailed arguments, where others, for example economists and social theorists, could then look over their shoulders and say, this is a very lousy argument, this could be publicly debated and so on. And it wouldn't be so easy, I think, to buy off these experts or to place experts into that position who are not really experts. Of course, the nomination process would here have to be thought about quite carefully, because if, for example, countries nominate these experts, you might get exactly the same problem that I described about your proposal. But I think something along those lines could actually work.
I agree with you that if it is just representatives of poor countries, it could be manipulated. Similarly, experts can be manipulated. I just wanted to emphasize that if this is there as a concept, a filter, then the details can be worked out. For example, currently in our country there is a heated debate going on the ombudsman. The concept is fine, the structures can be many. So similarly, if you agree it as a concept, the structures can be worked out over a period of time.
Thank you, Mr. Kaur. Next question. Gentleman in the jacket there.
So I'll try to... causing a problem, sir. Yeah.
Good evening, Professor. It's clearly been a few years since I started an economics class, so I had to pay attention in the Health Impact Fund speech, but it was great. I loved it. But I wanted to step back a little, and your underpinnings before you spoke about the Health Impact Fund were how India has the ability to influence economic decisions outside in the larger world, in larger context. From my perspective, though, we seem to be doing that by following the exact same trajectory in terms of inequality. My question is, do you think India can do something differently with inequality or growing inequality to actually lead by example rather than just as a function of growing economic might?
I didn't the role that India has played.
I have to apologize. It's a little hard. We have an echo here on the stage, and it's a little bit hard to hear. But I just got the gist, I think, of it. And I think the best answer to that question is that this is up to you to decide what India will be, right? India's future is open, and certainly I don't know, and I don't think any one of you can just say, I know what role India will play. And of course, history is littered with sad examples of countries that, when they were small and weak, were protesting against the hegemony of that country and the overbearingness of that other country. And when they became big and strong, did exactly the same things, lorded it over weaker countries and so forth. But again, that is something that you shape your own future, and we all look with great hope and great expectations to India, which is, after all, the world's largest and greatest democracy. So what I hope will happen is that India will be two things. It will, on the one hand, be a model for many other emerging countries, many other developing countries, a model that shows that prosperity and the eradication of poverty can go hand in hand with a thoroughly democratic system that will defeat, if you like, the thesis quite popular a little bit to the east of here, that you have to choose between emphasizing civil and political liberties and political participation in particular on the one hand, and emphasizing social and economic freedoms on the other hand. And I also hope, of course, that India, in the increasingly important role that it is playing in international negotiations, will be true to its roots and true to the fact that the majority of Indians is still quite poor. The natural thing to happen in India is that the vast majority of Indians will not take a lot of interest in international affairs. They will not take a lot of interest in what the Indian delegation at this or that or the other important high-level meeting or summit is saying or pushing for. Those who have the ability to inform themselves, to really know in depth what's going on, are those who have the strongest incentives to influence, and those are the big Indian corporations and the Indian billionaires and so on. So if the Indian government is influenced by them in regard to the international negotiation posture, and not influenced by anybody else, then it's very likely that the Indian government will do the bidding of that small elite. And that, I think, is where you should try to contest, and you should try, for example, academics, experts, people who know about international affairs, should say, no, in these important negotiations for this free trade agreement or this international trade arrangement, India should be on the side of the poor. India should not just represent the interests of its big corporations, but also represent the interest of the majority of the people, and thereby indirectly the interests of the poor worldwide.
Yes.
Professor Poga, thank you very much for an extremely illuminating talk. I just want to say globalization, justice, human rights, which you talked about, and increasingly through the communication revolution, we have been seeing all these issues coming to the fore. Although, as Rahul ji said, globalization dates back to 600 BC, and when in Sanna they talked about compassion. But in this context, what I want to ask you is, today we are seeing an increasing amount of corporate greed which is happening all across the world, and we are seeing protests in the Occupy Wall Street protests that are taking place in the US and also now spreading elsewhere. So in this context, at the same time, there's also increasing talk of CSR, or corporate social responsibility. So in this context, how do you see policymakers and governments working together at the international level to achieve a balance whereby we can have minimal corporate greed with an increasing amount of CSR, which can bring about some kind of increase in the abysmal conditions of social justice which are justified by the figures that you've talked about? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that I'm not quite sure that there is increasing corporate greed. I think the greed has always been there. I think the greed is just now much more able to break itself apart. And one important reason for that is that the playing field has become much larger. So a corporation can now take the whole world as its hunting ground and can, so to speak, make money everywhere. And that you see that especially in the financial industry. Right? The great banks have conquered the world. They are now offering investment products anywhere. They are repackaging loans and mortgages, reselling things, and so the scale on which they operate has become so much larger. The leverage has become so much greater. The forum shopping, that they can register themselves in the Cayman Islands, or they can go to wherever they find the regulations to be most to their liking and the tax rates to be lowest. These sorts of freedoms have increased. So the greed has always been there, but it has more free rein now, and also both the ability and the incentives to spend large amounts of money on influencing rule-making procedures. That has, I think, increased. So now about corporate social responsibility. I'm not a great optimist about corporate social responsibility. I think that almost all of what runs under that title is essentially just propaganda. So that you have tens of thousands of voluntary corporate codes of one sort or another, where corporations are signing up and they say, we will do X, we will do Y. These are normally very high-sounding, beautifully phrased formulations that commit companies to nothing. The people who are monitoring it are appointed by the companies themselves, and so on. So much of that is really just fake. And so the solution is not that. The solution really lies not with the corporations and them policing themselves. The solution lies with us citizens saying that we are the ones who set down the ground rules under which you operate. And we set the rules, and we will wrestle control over the rules away from you, and we will make sure that you operate under those rules, or else you don't operate at all. That's the way forward, I think.
Thank you. Yes.
Professor Poge, congratulations for very elegant lecture. I have one question and one request to address one contradiction in your lecture. First question. You refer to human rights as a minimal conception of justice. Could you please reflect on what is the maximum conception of justice? Second, you presented an excellent critique of international rule-shaping process in which powerful vested interests influence norms, institutions, structures, mechanisms and procedures. But when you come to your fundamental message, that is HIF, Health Insurance, Health Impact Forum, you propose the implementation of that proposal with the help of a treaty. How do you feel, how do you resolve the contradiction that that kind of treaty, which is essentially an international rule-making or rule-shaping process, will not be influenced by the same forces that have habit of influencing rule-making at international level? Thank you.
Good. So a maximum conception of justice is hard to say. I mean, basically, there are a lot of things that I would add to this minimal conception involving human rights. I think the most important thing to add, first and foremost, would be a constraint on inequality. So the simple conception of justice that I proposed, that we should try to achieve a world in which institutions are so designed that human rights are realized insofar as that's reasonably possible, that world could be still one with enormous inequalities, where some people are at the threshold where their human rights are just barely fulfilled, and others are vastly richer, and also it could be a world in which those who are richer take a disproportionate share of global economic growth, so that the distance between the rich and the poor is increasing and increasing, with the poor perhaps just getting stuck at that lowest level of basic human rights fulfillment. So that certainly has to be added to the standard list of human rights. Now, the second point, I didn't mean to say that this is all Western influence. I think that we are now living in a world in which the emerging economies have increasing influence, and where it's a really important question whose interest the Chinese government, the Indian government, the Brazilian government, and so on, is representing on the international stage. Would it be the interest